What's up, y'all? I'm Bella Dee, representing for Books for Crooks on the Blockout podcast. You already know. Today, I'm going to be reading to you the Chicano Movement for Beginners. So if you don't know nada about the Chicano Movement, it's all good. I got you. This book was gifted to me by my tia, and she wrote in the cover, "Dear Bella, I hope you are inspired by this history as it forms part of your identity and heritage. From one of your biggest fans, Bean, December 2019. I wish that for y'all too. I hope you're inspired by this history." So today I'm going to be reading a little part to you on the Chicano Moratorium and the death of Ruben Salazar. The Chicano Moratorium. By the late 1960s, the anti-Vietnam War movement had grown to hundreds of thousands strong, with countless demonstrations and university campus strikes across the country. Public support for the U.S. involvement waned dramatically as the war dragged on with no end in sight as the number of casualties rose. The Mexican-American community was slow to turn against the war. However, in part because of a proud history of serving in the U.S. military, this had long been viewed as a way to prove one's patriotism and contribution to society at large. Organizations such as the American GI Forum lobbied on behalf of Mexican-American veterans, arguing that their service entitled them to respect and equal treatment. But as more and more Mexican Americans returned home in body bags and in disproportionate numbers, Mexican Americans represented more than 20% of casualties in the Southwest, but only 10% of the population, and it became harder to support the war effort. What's more, as the Chicano movement gave visibility to the mistreatment faced by the Mexican American community, many began to question why young Chicanos were fighting poor brown people in Vietnam when the real struggle was in the barrios at home. Chicanos began to refuse induction into the armed forces. Among them were such prominent activists as Solomon Valdenegro of Tucson, Arizona, Ernesto Vigil of Denver's Crusade for Justice, and Rosalio Munoz, a former student body president at University of California, LA. On September 16, 1969, Munoz attempted to bring attention to his draft refusal by holding a protest at the local induction center. In a speech delivered that day, he declared his independence from the Selective Service. "I accuse the draft, the entire social, political, and economic system of the United States of America, of creating a funnel which shoots Mexican youth into Vietnam to be killed and to kill innocent men, women, and children." Traveling around the Southwest speaking to other activists about the draft, Munoz became convinced that what was needed was a national Chicano peace protest. Meanwhile, earlier that year, the Brown Berets had returned from the Denver Chicano Youth and Liberation Conference, where they had discussed the war's negative impact. Corky Gonzalez and the Crusade for Justice had long voiced opposition to the war based on the disproportionate toll it took on poor communities. Thus, many youth left the conference convinced that they needed to raise awareness back home. On December 19, 1969, the Brown Berets held the first Chicano Moratorium Committee rally at Obregon Park in East LA. The turnout of nearly 2,000 people surprised organizers, who immediately began planning another one. They also asked Munoz to be a co-chairman of the planning committee. On February 28, 1970, the CMC organized another rally at nearby Salazar Park, this one attended by 5,000 people. The event brought significant attention to the CMC, which decided to build on the momentum and organize yet another even larger moratorium on August 29th. The CMC was renamed the National Chicano Moratorium Committee, and with the financial support of the Southwest Council of La Raza, Munoz began organizing full-time for the event. At the second annual Chicano Youth Conference that March in Denver, Munoz gathered the support of Corky Gonzalez and fellow draft resistor Ernesto Vigil. In the months leading up to the national moratorium, attendees sponsored hundreds of anti-war demonstrations throughout the Southwest. Although everyone was united against the war, not all the organizers agreed politically. The more radical activists opposed the war for anti-colonist and anti-imperialist reasons. Many of them even sided with the Viet Cong and their leader, Ho Chi Minh, viewing him as a freedom fighter in the same vein as Che Guevara. Damn, I didn't know that. Others saw the war and its draft policy, which left Chicanos few opportunities for deferment, as a genocidal conspiracy against minorities who were dying in inordinate numbers while their communities languished at home. The more moderate activists, uncomfortable with those controversial reasons, simply couldn't accept the countless flag-draped coffins returning home from a war being fought for reasons they didn't understand. Some of these political differences played out in organizing the moratorium, as almost 150 people ended up on the steering committee. Despite the division among organizers, thousands of activists arrived from all over the United States on August 29, 1970, to join the local Mexican-American community march 3 miles down Whittier Boulevard toward Laguna Park, where the main rally was to be held. The organizing committee had recruited hundreds of monitor volunteers to preserve the peace and quell any disturbances. They were joined by hundreds of stone-faced police officers and sheriff deputies who erected barricades along the parade route and by all accounts were prepared for a riot. In the largest mass protest in Mexican-American history, indeed the largest anti-war effort by any American minority group, between 20,000 and 30,000 people took part in the Chicano moratorium. Most of the demonstrators were young, but there were also many families with children. The mood was festive as musicians and performers entertained the crowd. Despite the heavy police presence, none of the marchers expected the violence that ensued. Responding to a disturbance at a nearby liquor store where local youth stole soft drinks and beer, police found their excuse to break up the demonstration. As Rosalio Munoz was about to speak, squad cars descended upon the park, and police officers in full riot gear began forcing participants to leave. Some of the demonstrators, angry at the mistreatment, hurled objects at the officers. They in turn responded with even more aggression, wielding their clubs and moving across the park in military formation. Tear gas canisters were fired at the crowd. Men, women, and children, many of whom hadn't heard the orders to disperse, were simply confused by the unfolding events, were trapped and panicked. Frustrated protesters began to riot and were viciously clubbed by police. Others were caught up in the mayhem and trampled. By the time the smoke cleared, several hundred demonstrators had been arrested, including Corky Gonzalez, one of the slated speakers. 60 demonstrators were wounded, and 2 Chicano youths were killed. One of them was a 15-year-old brown beret. Perhaps the most alarming result of the violence was the death of Ruben Salazar, a respected journalist from the LA Times who had become an inadvertent spokesman for the Chicano movement. Salazar's death and the brutal police response to a mostly peaceful demonstration was yet another reminder that the quest for Mexican-American civil rights was viewed as a dangerous threat to the status quo. Ruben Salazar's death at the Chicano moratorium transformed him into a Chicano martyr. The irony is that Salazar was far from being a militant. In fact, he was a classic example of the Mexican-American generation, a middle-class driver who did his job quietly and diligently and kept his distance from politics and civil rights. The bulk of his work as a journalist, including stints as a foreign correspondent in Latin America and war correspondent in Vietnam, displayed no overt criticism of the United States or its politics. When he returned to LA, Salazar began covering the Mexican-American community, which included the growing Chicano activism. His articles straddled the line. He was both sympathetic to the aims of the protesters while at times criticizing their tactics. Perhaps more importantly, Salazar translated the goals of the Chicano activists for a skeptical public, in a way explained the Chicanos themselves a clear way of articulating their position to the rest of the world. A good example of this in his Times column of February 6, 1970, entitled, "Who is a Chicano and What is it that the Chicanos Want?" In a blunt and succinct opening line, he captures the essence of that identity. A Chicano is a Mexican-American with non-Anglo image of himself. Increasingly, Salazar began reporting on police brutality in the Mexican-American community, including the shooting of 2 innocent Mexican nationals. Dissatisfied with the official police reports, he provided his own coverage of the killings, which prompted 2 policemen to visit Salazar and request that he tone down his reporting. It was stirring up the Mexican-American community, they claimed. Undeterred, Salazar wrote a column about their visit. Other intimidation tactics soon followed. Both local law enforcement and the FBI opened files on the reporter, suspecting him of radical activity. After covering the moratorium march and the mayhem that ensued, Salazar and several fellow journalists stopped at the Silver Dollar, a nearby bar, to have a beer before heading off to write their articles. Shortly after they entered, a sheriff deputy who claimed later that he was responding to a report that a gunman was inside shot a tear gas projectile into the crowded bar. The 10-inch projectile struck Salazar in the head and killed him. His body lay on the floor for 3 hours before homicide detectives came to investigate. Eyewitnesses and deputies offered conflicting accounts, and details surrounding the killing remained murky. Because of his public visibility, along with his prior criticism of police brutality, many couldn't help but think that Salazar's death was intentional. Despite photo evidence that showed the deputies ordering bystanders back into the bar and then firing indiscriminately into the crowded establishment, an inquest found that Salazar's death was an accident. The officer was not charged. Salazar was the first mainstream journalist to cover Chicano community, and his absence was felt immediately after the moratorium. The newspapers that covered the event ran stories regurgitating the police reports. According to a brief article in the New York Times, for example, 500 police and sheriff's deputies tried to break up roaming gangs. Most newspapers ignored it completely. Salazar, having witnessed the events firsthand and sympathetic to the cause of the tens of thousands of demonstrators, would have told a far different story. Salazar's death and the police violence at the Chicano moratorium outraged community members and Chicano activists. Often the moratorium is referred to as the pinnacle of the Chicano movement. Tens and thousands of Chicanos, young and old, gathered to demonstrate for their civil rights. But it was also a movement of great tragedy, in some ways the beginning of the movement's decline. Following the moratorium, organizers planned further protests, this time focused on police brutality, but police responded with more violence. The intimidation worked. Attendance at subsequent rallies dwindled. Law enforcement also escalated tactics to infiltrate and undermine the activist groups, including the National Chicano Moratorium Committee and the Brown Berets. Paranoia fueled division in the ranks, and the organizations became less effective as they focused more on internal squabbles and power struggles. The energy and shared vision that had inspired the burst of activism from the high school blowouts in 1968 to the Chicano moratorium in 1970 had taken a serious blow from which it never truly recovered. Despite public resistance and intense political mobilization, few of the Chicano activists' demands had never been met. In Occupied America, his classic text of Chicano history, Rodolfo Acuña summarized the state of the movement at this moment. After the smoke cleared, in spite of real change for most North Americans, very little progress had been made by Chicanos. The importance of activists, youth, and grassroots organizations declined after this point. The 1970s restored to the middle class its hegemony over the movement. All right, y'all, what did you think about that? Do you know that part of history? If not, it's all good. We're all learning at our own pace, you know? My book club chose this book to read next month. So for June, July, that's what we're going to be reading. So if you want to read along with us and you want to know more, it's all in here. Hit us up, Books for Crooks on Instagram, and I'm going to link where you could cop this book in the description below. And you already know, Books for Crooks, Blockout Podcast. We'll see you next week.